But essentially, I think that AWS hasn't done what it needed to do to build these services. That's why we see services like Memento and Neon and some of these other ones, because they haven't built an equivalent version of that within AWS.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was like, some nervousness around your love and use of like App Runner, and how, and I think that kind of leans into this thing that's coming up recently around deprecation of AWS services, like, Code Commit, Cloud Search, Snowmobile, Work Docs are all sort of in these like deprecation cycles right now, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. And I'm kind of curious, like, what are your thoughts on this move that recently from AWS to start, satelliting some of these services with maybe not a ton of communication about what they're doing?
If I was hired as the CEO of AWS, I would cut hard and I would cut deep, because the service sprawl there is incomprehensible to the average person, and there are a lot of services that I would cut.
Do you think AI is affecting the job market for devs right now? Like, are we seeing a softer job market because of AI?
I think there are too many. I think there are too many companies that are buying into the hype that AI is somehow going to replace developers.
Originally, when I kind of looked at Ampt, I thought of it more as like a platform, as a service, and clearly it's something that's like fundamentally different. So, what is it that someone that's maybe using something like a platform as a service, like, is cost the main hurdle there? Like, why don't those systems work for these folks today, and where does essentially Ampt, this approach step in and kind of like fix some of those issues?
Hey folks, this is Alex. Great show for you today. As Sean joins me on the show, we also have a special guest. We had Jeremy Daly, who is an old friend of mine in the cloud. He joined us on the show, and I really just trust and respect him on a lot of things. He's seen a lot, and I think has a pretty wise opinion on this. Jeremy's the co-founder of Ampt, which is building like a abstraction infrastructure layer on top of AWS, just to make it simpler to sift through all the different options and develop on AWS and do best practices there. So I really wanted to get his opinions on a lot of just different infrastructure stuff that he's seeing, how AI is changing development. We even talk about some front end stuff at the end, and HTMX, and whether it's real, whether it's a troll. So lots of good stuff in this episode. As always, if you have any questions or guests that you want to see on the show, anything like that, feel free to reach out to me or Sean. And with that, let's get to the show. Sean, it's good to see you. How you been?
I'm doing well. It's been a super busy summer. I feel like we haven't chatted live since we were together in Miami back in May. It's just been like Slack messages and texting back and forth over the last little while. I haven't been home for a weekend in like a month and a half over the summer. Just like work stuff, personal stuff, all this kind of stuff going on.
Yep, for sure. And I hear you have some big trips coming up, including Shift in Croatia.
Yeah, I'm in Europe in a couple of weeks, and then Australia, and then off to Canada for a personal trip. But yeah, 3 international trips in like a month, 5 weeks or something like that coming up. So I definitely owe my wife some flowers and maybe like some parenting relief at the end of that.
Yep. I've actually got a couple international trips. I'm going to Canada next week for like 2 days just to do some training there.
And then, say hello to my to the motherland
homelanders. Yep, exactly. and then heading to Poland, and my wife is coming with me. So like I'm speaking at a conference there for 1 day, and then we're going to be there for 8 days and just do Warsaw and Krakow and things like that. And so I've never been to Poland. That's actually like sort of my homeland. Like my mom is like half Polish, so I'm excited to go check out Poland.
Nice. You get some pierogies.
Yep, exactly. So it's good to see you. I'm also excited because we have a guest on the show today. This is an old friend of mine. So Jeremy Daly is joining us. Jeremy is the founder of Ampt. He's an AWS serverless hero. He's a publisher of Off by None, and just like someone I trust a lot on his opinions and just enjoy a lot. So Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me here.
Yeah, absolutely. Why don't you give, I gave a little bit high level overview of who you are and what you do, but what you've been working on lately?
What have I been working on lately? It's been a crazy 2-3 years, I guess, post pandemic. I guess in the beginning of the pandemic, I started working for Serverless Inc. on this really cool project called Serverless Cloud. The idea was essentially to build a platform that you could deploy your serverless framework apps to that would run on top of AWS, but you wouldn't have to set up an AWS account. That actually kicked off sort of a whole movement. Doug Moskrop and I were early on that project, and kind of came up with this idea of infrastructure from code, which was this idea that was like, hey, can we just read your application code, turn that into something that can provision infrastructure for you? We pushed that pretty far, eventually split that off into this company Ampt, which we co-founded with Emre Shamdan and Russ Schick and Doug Moskrop. So we started this company, been working on it for the last 2 years or so. A lot of AI noise out there right now, which I'm sure we can talk about a little bit later, and some other things. But we built a pretty cool product. That's been the majority of my focus. I've also been doing quite a bit of consulting work as well, both from an Amp perspective and just as a serverless cloud perspective and so forth. But like, if you want ancient history, started a web development company out of my dorm room in 1997, turned that into a good-sized agency, did that for 12 years, got sick of building forms for other people, and eventually sold that off, and built a startup around social media, a social media site for parents, and then parlayed that into a VP of product position at another startup that was doing some cool stuff, and then did a whole bunch of ML and natural language processing stuff at another startup, and then just went through that whole cycle and just was able to kind of follow on all the trends. But I think my biggest claim to fame for me is I'm always early. So I'm always early on every tech thing that comes out there. And I build something and I'm like, this is amazing. Why is nobody doing this? And then like 4 or 5 years later, somebody else is doing it and they somehow succeeded with it. So one of these days I'm going to get it right. And I'm going to be right there I'm going to get the timing right. Let's put it that way.
The timing stuff. I mean, also, hearing your history there, you spent a lot of time not only on early technologies, but doing, startups and stuff. And startup life is tough. Like I feel like the 7 years that I was a founder it was more like 20 years. Like it's like they're like president years essentially. You go in, you're like fresh faced, 18-year-old. You come out 2 years later, you're
all the gray in the beard. Yeah, right.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm excited to have you on because I love talking about infrastructure. A lot of the people I have on the show are like database people or just like different types of infrastructure. And I know you have a lot of experience with infrastructure, and especially working on Ampt, you're trying to orchestrate all of this infrastructure for your different clients, and you see a lot, you talk to a lot of teams and just different things like that. I guess when you're building Ampt and things like that, what were some of the hard things about building Ampt?
Well, yeah, I mean, to just get sort of an overview on infrastructure, because this seems to be something that is a ongoing debate on social as to whether or not AWS is infrastructure. Like if you're writing CloudFormation or CDK, are you actually deploying infrastructure? Or are you just using these cloud services? You probably can't see on camera, but I have scars all over my hands from working with real infrastructure when I used to rack and stack servers in a co-location facility and drive there at 2 o'clock in the morning when a drive failed and it had to be swapped out manually. I love AWS and these services. I still know that somebody is racking and stacking servers and cutting their hands every time they open one. So I appreciate those people very much. So I maybe have a different perspective on, what I consider infrastructure, but the ability for you to just go ahead and deploy these services, no matter whatever you want to call them, I think is quite a magical thing that too many people take for granted nowadays. Especially, a lot of people in startups where you see startups with a few $100,000 that are able to build these amazing things. It's like, yeah, you wouldn't have been able to do that 15, 20 years ago because you wouldn't have been able to afford the infrastructure. Although we may have overcomplicated some stuff as well. But I mean, the biggest challenge I think with infrastructure from a cloud standpoint is sort of getting it right? Because if you're thinking about just the lift and shift of spin up an EC2 instance, which is the first thing we did, by the way. I approached the cloud. I had everything in my own co-location facility, and the first thing I did with AWS was take every service I had running in this co-location facility and move it over to EC2. And this was actually even before RDS, because we were using a SQL Server in the background to power some of the apps. And we essentially had to spin up SQL Server, install SQL Server. I remember this is being recorded, right? I remember stealing the key, the software key, and installing that on servers before they had that, or on EC2 instances before they had that. But this was even before load balancers. I mean, this is ancient.
Right, EC2
AWS,
classic, not even VPCs or anything
right,
like that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that was my first sort of foray into AWS infrastructure. And even that was amazing. And essentially that cut like our costs from a co-location facility where we're paying about $7,000 a month with redundant electricity and high speed internet. And obviously, all the cage fees and everything that was there to like $700 a month to have a couple of EC2 instances running, right? So I immediately knew, I'm like, okay, this is game changing, that sort of approach. But so that was relatively simple, right? You're just deploying servers like we were doing now. Now, what is there? 300 some odd services at AWS. They all have to interact with one another. I mean, the complexity is not in the service itself. DynamoDB, I mean, I know, Alex, that's that's one
I've heard of it.
Expertise. You've heard of that service?
Yeah.
That's one of those services where it's complex. I mean, there's a lot of things you have to think about to do, but you don't have to run it. You don't have to do a lot of configuration. It's kind of there. It works for you. So that's not the complexity. The complexity is when you're reading off of a DynamoDB stream and it's going to a Lambda function and you have these permissions, and what happens if it fails, and then how do you drain it or retries and batch sizes and all this other stuff. So the complexity with infrastructure today is more about the connections between it because of the distributed nature of that. And that's the biggest, I think your question was, what challenges have we seen? I mean, basically the challenges that I've seen building this way for the last, 10 years plus, when we started using more services, the challenges is getting that complexity, or getting those interconnectivity, the cross-service connections to these different pieces of infrastructure. Getting that right is the hardest thing, and again, that's where we see that's what we're trying to sort of solve with Ampt, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, that's the big piece of it.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned, so when we were, just introducing you, was this idea of trying to like analyze the code to figure out like what services deploy. So like, what is that workflow? Like, are you doing? Is that what's happening? You're basically like analyzing someone's code base and then figuring out which services or what sort of pattern of deployment makes sense, and then running, spinning up the services and essentially offloading all that complexity.
Yeah. So, and that's actually been one of the biggest challenges. So our original sort of idea was like, how far can we push this idea of infrastructure from code, which was to say, if you write an API or you write a database connection, is there a way that you could extract from that, whether through static code analysis or, parsing the AST or something like that? Could you look at that and say, oh, okay, you're trying to call a DynamoDB table called, my table or whatever it is, right? And you're making a put item request, or you're doing a get batch, items or something like that, and be able to look at all of that information and say, can we then spin up a DynamoDB table for you, call that, and give you the right IAM permissions and some of these things? And that was sort of where we started. Like, is that possible? And it probably is, with a lot of research, but also think about, our biggest thing has been deterministic deploys. Like, you can't just make a code change and then it suddenly drops a table for you or something like that. So we took a different approach. And what we said was, for the most part, there's a set of services that you can run in an AWS account that will do most what you need to do. So CDNs, Lambda functions, a DynamoDB table, an event bridge queue, SQS, a couple of these different things. And those things can all kind of interact with one another. There's some basic permissions that you can give those. And then we said, okay, if we take your application code and just deploy that, then if we parse the AST and look at the different services that you're trying to call, the different handlers that you're writing, and we're very much so handler based, right? So it's like you write a task handler, you write an event listener, you write a storage listener, you write an API listener. Essentially, they're listeners, right? And it's all Node, by the way. It's all TypeScript, JavaScript. So we tried to follow that consistent pattern of like that, like it's a handler, it's an event-driven system. And so we pick up that handler, we say, oh, you want to run a task. Okay, great. So we know that you want to run a task, and then we see, oh, you've actually said you want to run this task every 5 minutes, or want to run it on this, this cron schedule. So we can actually take that, or maybe I want to listen for a particular event or whatever. So we can actually read that in on the AST and say, okay, well, we need to create an event bridge rule here, or we need to add a timer here, or I guess there's called event bridge rules now for scheduling things too. But so we have to do this, or you have a data.on handler, so you want to listen to data changes. So now we need to make sure that we create that connection for that DynamoDB stream connection and filter that to the right function. So we took the approach, and this is again, and look, we're a startup. We've been doing this for quite some time. We've figured out some really cool things, but we still don't know how to sell it. We still don't know how to explain it because it is still very, very new. And the way that we've been thinking about it lately, because this is essentially what we did, is we built basically a pre-configured hosting environment for you in an AWS account, right? And then it's programmable in the sense that it reads that in from your code. It looks at what you're doing in your code, sees what handlers there are and so forth, and then it can actually sort of configure or adapt that infrastructure to do certain things. And then we push that further in the sense that we said, look, okay, now you've got something like a task. So let's just take the task example. If that task has to run for 15 minutes, well, you could run that in a Lambda function. A little expensive to run a task in a Lambda function. So we're like, well, what if you wanted to run it for 30 minutes? We're like, well, what if we just load that same code into a Fargate container and run it in a Fargate container? So we did that. And then we're like, well, what if you have like a high velocity API and Lambda gets kind of expensive? We're like, well, App Runner is a great little service that we could do that. So we essentially built a way that we take your uncompiled code, right? Just the code that comes right from your Git repository. And we can compile that down so that it will run in Lambda functions, it will run in App Runner, it will run in Fargate, and then we can dynamically change where the compute is based off of what it is you're trying to do. So if you have a high velocity API or website, we have one customer who does like 1.6 billion requests per month for a Next.js app. That just routes right into App Runner, right? But if you're running a half-hour task, then it will automatically switch to Fargate and run that in the background. So it's probably too much information, but again, this is part of our problem. Sort of trying to market this service is that it takes a long time to explain, and you can't really whittle. We haven't figured out a way to whittle that down into one tagline yet.
How do you even you're talking about Lambda and App Runner and Fargate, and you're like one of the 3 people I know that is just like an App Runner like advocate and just loves it. And it's like the same 3 people. And I love all you guys. So I feel like there's something that must be there. But like, there's famously like 17 ways to run containers in AWS. How did you even choose the different ones? Are you just trying out a bunch of different ones? Are you talking to people and service teams? Like, how did you figure out, hey, App Runner is actually like, this is a sweet spot for a certain set of workloads?
Yeah, so when App Runner was first launched, we were like, okay, this is sort of a interesting thing, like why another way to do it? But here's what's super exciting about App Runner is that it has its own built-in load balancer. So if you create an ECS cluster and you want to run, you want to run your app using Fargate on the backside of an ECS cluster, you certainly can do that, and that works great. The only problem is you can't route traffic to it, right? So you have to set up an ALB in order to route traffic to that. Now, an ALB at the very least costs, I don't know, $29 a month, something like that. So if you just want to have an application sitting there and it's a small app, just to run in an ECS or EKS, you have to get that load balancer in front of it. So we were exploring this and we said, well, we can do ECS. Like that makes sense because we did have people requesting, like, can we not run this on Lambda? Because again, it just doesn't scale the right way when you do certain things. I mean, it scales, it just, the cost doesn't scale the way you would expect it to. So we looked at ECS. And then we're like, yeah, but having that load balance is kind of a pain. And then we were looking at App Runner. We're like, wait a minute, App Runner doesn't need to have that. And then the other thing that is really, really cool about App Runner is App Runner has 2 modes. So it has this sort of like provision mode, and then it has like active mode, right? So you can provision containers, and it's super cheap. It's like, I don't know, 7 zeros and a 7 cents per hour, whatever it is, or per minute or something like that, that keeps a container provisioned for you. And then as soon as it gets traffic, it switches it to active mode in milliseconds. Like, it's fast. So it's kind of like provision concurrency for Lambda, but like 1,000 times cheaper, right? And so you can have a container that's running in this provision mode, and the second it gets traffic, it switches into active mode. There's no cold starts. Like, it is very, very cool. And you can say, I want this many containers to actually spin up into active mode at some particular time. So you can actually say, like, I only want 10 containers to spin up. And if you only spin up 10 containers, then you can actually cap your costs, right? So that's another big complaint where, somebody puts something on Vercel, and then next thing you know, it goes viral, and then they get a $128,000 bill. This is a really interesting way to sort of prevent that from happening. So I love App Runner. I've heard scary rumors about, the success of App Runner internally, and it makes me really nervous because I think it's a highly underutilized service that is very, very cool.
Mm-hmm. Originally, I think when I kind of looked at Ampt, I thought of it more as like a platform, as a service, and clearly it's something that's like fundamentally different. So, like, what is it that someone that's maybe using something like a platform as a service, like, is cost the main hurdle there? Like, why don't those systems work for these folks today, and where does essentially Ampt this approach step in and kind of like fix some of those issues?
Yeah. So I think part of it is understanding too how Ampt works kind of behind the scenes in terms of different environments and so forth. So essentially what Ampt does is it creates what we call Ampt environments. So those run in an isolated AWS account, and that has a bunch of pre-provisioned services, like I said. So that's an Ampt environment. That communicates back with the Ampt orchestration service. So basically what the Ampt orchestration service does is it will create those environments for you. It does all of the routing, sets everything up. It manages all of the user permissions and so forth. So as a user, when you spin up a new application in Ampt, that will connect to it'll provision an AWS account for you, set up the AWS or set up that Ampt environment, and then that's dedicated to that basically one stage or one environment of that app. Then if you publish that to like a dev environment or to prod or whatever, it'll spin up another AWS account with another Ampt environment that's completely isolated. And the idea is that all of those environments are they're the same, right? So if you build something in your dev sandbox environment, that's all synced instantly to the cloud. You have this really cool interactive way of building apps. That when you publish that will run the exact same way in prod as it will run in dev or in your sandbox. And the reason for that is because we want that production parity, that sort of high fidelity sandboxes, as we call them, so that you have the capabilities to do that. So that's the idea behind how we sort of do it. So when an app is running in an AWS account, it pretty much runs completely independent of the Ampt service. So we do send some telemetry back. If it's a preview account, we do some quotas and some of those things. So there is some communication with the main service. But the goal here really is to say, this is running in its own separate AWS account, which, eventually, we hope more people will own their own AWS account as opposed to us managing it. But the orchestration of actually setting those up and deploying the code, CI/CD, by the way, that's all built in. Like, you don't have to worry about any of that other stuff. It just works. So we tried to simplify the whole software development lifecycle. So going back to your question about PaaS. So the thing about PaaS is, I think there's some really great PaaSes out there, right? I mean, Vercel, people love Vercel. It works really, really well. If you're building Next.js, which again, we can talk about that maybe, but if you're building Next.js, like Vercel is the place that you probably are going to want to host it if you want to take advantage of the ecosystem that they built. There's a couple of other PaaSes. I mean, I would still consider, or I do consider, something like Neon is still technically a PaaS, right? Like it offers an infrastructure service, but it still has some of those PaaS sort of capabilities to it. So I think the problem that some people face, and I think others have pointed this out as well, or I guess problems that other people encounter, is if you have to connect 10 different services. So if you're using a workflow service, which I forget, is it ingest is still defer.run, I think is now part of ingest or something like that. But so you get like ingest, which is the ability for you to run these workflows remotely. I mean, how much data do you want to pass into a third-party service? Like, I'm thinking about workflows. Like, the workflows we run are like super data intensive. That's why we run workflows, right? Because there's so many steps and so many checkpoints and things like that you need to make sure and verify. Often those workflows need to have access to very secure data or bits of information that you wouldn't just ship off to a third party. So there is something about egress, right? There is, do I have to contact this other service? How long does that API take? Can I run things sort of internally versus having to use a third party service? And this is what we're trying. This is part of the approach with Ampt, is to say AWS does pretty much everything that these other PaaSes do. It's just you're often building some custom or bespoke solution in order to make it do what that other thing does. So that's where it comes back to the idea of productized patterns, which we talked about briefly before. But the idea of a productized pattern is to say, if you can encapsulate the thing that a PaaS does or a part of a PaaS does, if you can encapsulate that thing and you can productize it, meaning that all of the interconnections between the services and all the failovers and all the fallbacks and all the retries and all that kind of stuff is there, and you can kind of guarantee that that will do what you need it to do, but it will run on AWS. That's what we're trying to do. So if you need a queuing solution or you need a caching solution or you need some of these other things, let's first look at, can I run this directly on AWS within my own account with access to whatever services I need to without giving some third party more access than they need? Can I do that all there? And then, and only then, if you can't do that, let me reach for a third party tool. So I do think that PaaS is important. And I do think PaaS is very different than SaaS too. I mean, I know we all know this, but like there's some things that sort of blur the line, I think. But I do think that PaaS is a great choice for a lot of people to get started with things. But I do think that when things become more serious, it does potentially pose a problem. And that's part of what we're trying to do is we want to eliminate the graduation problem, right? So if you build something on Vercel and it works really great, and maybe you've got some backend APIs that are written on their serverless functions or whatever, and that's fine. But at some point, if you graduate beyond that and say, well, we need to do more than what we can run in these serverless functions, then you have to start building a backend. And then where do you build that backend? And then do you move all of your backend off of Vercel in order to do that? And then you're just using Vercel to connect to the front end, and then eventually maybe you move off of that. So I don't know. That's my thought on it. But what our biggest, and I think this podcast talks about VCs, right? That's been the biggest challenge we've had with VCs is this notion of like, well, when do people graduate from your service? And we're like, we hope they don't. We hope to build a system in which they don't have to graduate.
Yeah, and that's the main challenge I've seen with PaaS is that graduation problem. Is like at some point, if you are successful, you're just going to, for either cost reasons or scale reasons or whatever, have to graduate from those platforms to something where you can go in and really like have more control over what you're doing, and have a better sense for where you're spending as well. And that's going to be a painful migration at some point in most companies' journeys.
Yep, absolutely. One thing that is interesting to talk about is just like, hey, each Ampt environment is getting its own AWS account, which means like you had to build a bunch of like background tooling to manage a lot of AWS accounts. I guess like how, like, was that a major challenge? Am I overestimating what that was like, or is that like a total pain to do a lot of that?
No, that's actually huge. I mean, what we did, and we actually used the serverless framework for a lot of this. So we used serverless framework tooling, and that was part legacy sort of because we were at serverless serverless Inc. when we did it. But actually, it's been fine because the other thing that we've done is most of the convenience features that the serverless framework we use that. But then we also use just the resources section. I think if you're familiar with the resources section of the serverless.yaml to define a lot of CloudFormation. And we actually, we talked about Terraform, we talked about, CDK, we talked about some of these other things. But we're like, all of that stuff, other than Terraform, Terraform, we were a little bit, we wanted to be careful with Terraform, but with like CDK, we're like, it's just going to compile down to CloudFormation anyways. And because it's such a strict thing that we have to do in order to make sure that every one of these environments is in the exact same state, we said, let's just write it in CloudFormation. So most of what we have is actually CloudFormation behind the scenes. And again, we're all AWS, right? So we don't do anything on GCP or Azure yet. We don't really have any plans for that. Like it's mostly focused on that. But the tooling behind the scenes is quite a bit. And so one of the things that we did was we took a lot of the orchestration stuff that you would normally run on like a CI/CD runner or like a GitHub Actions or something like that, and we brought it all into Lambda functions and state machines in order to do a lot of that. The workflow management stuff. So if you're familiar with Michael Hart, he built a thing called Yumda, and we actually use Yumda, which is basically Yum for Lambda. We actually use that as part of our build tool. So when we build your application for your environment, your build runs in the environment using a Lambda function, and then some of the tools with Yumda. So what it does is basically it's like, again, from a security standpoint, everything runs in your own account. It builds itself, like some of those things. And that's part of how we do like the deployment pieces of it for your actual application. And then we use similar stuff in order to build most of the deployment capabilities and all those workflows that use serverless, the serverless framework and CloudFormation to do that in our centralized accounts that reach out and do that. But we had to build an account vending machine, essentially. We had to build a whole bunch of stuff that maintains the state and a bunch of workflows that go and run these scripts and mutate the infrastructure and can read back the state of the infrastructure and make sure that things worked correctly. So it was not a simple task. So it is very complex system that does that.
Yeah, for sure. And man, I shout back to Yumda. Michael Hart, I miss him in the AWS ecosystem because he was always making like some wacky projects and some like really pushing the limits of it. We need him back. I want to ask like you mentioned sort of I call them like sort of third party infrastructure providers where you have like AWS, GCP, and Azure, and then you have like these other ones that are performing like a smaller piece of infrastructure. I guess like are there certain ones that you're leaning into? I know you all integrate with some of those in Ampt. I guess like how do you sort of like are there some you like and trust and say, hey, that is way better than what we can get on AWS, or how are you thinking about that?
Yeah, so I think I've been disappointed with AWS's pursuit of, quote unquote, serverlessness, because I've talked about this a number of times, and so they know, and I've talked to all the service teams too, so they know how I feel. But essentially, I think that AWS has not done itself, or it hasn't done what it needed to do to build these services. That's why we see services like Memento and Neon and some of these other ones, because they haven't built an equivalent version of that within AWS. And what I love about AWS from a serverless standpoint is that we literally deploy, again, a CDN. Actually, we deploy CDNs into like 7 different regions, which they're not always super happy about. We deploy ACM for our certificates.
They being AWS, or they being
AWS.
Really?
Yeah,
Okay,
we had to throttle some of the way that we use their some of their data planes and their service planes or control planes. But we spin up the CDN, we spin up a bunch of Lambda functions, a bunch of DynamoDB tables. We spin up all kinds of the ACMs, all the stuff. We spin up a ton of infrastructure. And in order for that infrastructure to sit there with no data storage or anything like that, costs exactly $0. And then as soon as you start to use it, then it starts to cost you a little bit of money. But most of that stuff is on demand, or you only pay when you're sort of, when you're storing some information. So that is magical from a developer workflow standpoint. And the whole point here is that if I've got 100 developers and I need them all to have their own AWS accounts so they can play around with things and not worry about, borrowing resources or some the noisy neighbor type thing or, resource contention, that kind of stuff. I want to give them all their own environments, but I can't spin up an RDS cluster in every single development account, right? Like I can't spin up an Elasticache service in everyone, or an ECS cluster with a load balancer running, right? Like it just gets too expensive. And again, maybe there are people who love to just throw money away, but I'm not one of those people, and I don't think other companies. I think a lot of other companies aren't, especially the startup. So the idea is that if I can spin up all of that infrastructure for free and only pay when I use it, like that's the ideal situation for me. there is no good solution for caching. Elasticache serverless is not a serverless service, right? Aurora serverless is not a serverless service in the sense that I can't just say, hey, create a table for me or create a cache for me, and then whatever data I'm storing in it, I'm willing to pay. But every time I hit it, I'll pay a small fee every time I hit it. That just doesn't exist. That does exist with something like Neon, which is pretty cool, and they're doing some pretty cool things. PlanetScale had something similar to that. I know they have a sort of baseline charge now. And again, just from my perspective, I say this all the time. I have no problem for paying for services when you're using them in production, but I need a high fidelity version of that service that I can use in a development mode that doesn't cost me the full price of running it, at even if it's at a lower level. I need that capability. And so Postgres, if you're using Neon Postgres, you get that for Postgres. If you're using Memento, you get that for caching as well as for their new topic service. They're working on their new storage service as well, which could be interesting. Although, again, the storage service like S3 is a great service. It's so good. But yeah, so in terms of other ones that I trust, like cachings is one of those things for me that's very, very lightweight. Like the whole idea is that I'm not going to use cache as a database. So if the cache goes away and I have to go right back to the database or I have to rebuild the cache, that's okay. I'm willing to sort of take that risk. Database a little bit less so, but I do like what Neon's doing.
One of the things you mentioned earlier was some nervousness around your love and use of App Runner, and how and I think that kind of leans into this thing that's coming up recently around deprecation of AWS services, Code Commit, Cloud Search, Snowmobile, WorkDocs are all sort of in these deprecation cycles right now, and there's a bunch of other ones as well. And I'm kind of curious, what are your thoughts on this move that recently from AWS to start satelliting some of these services with maybe not a ton of communication about what they're doing?
If I was hired as the CEO of AWS, I would cut hard and I would cut deep, because the service sprawl there is incomprehensible to the average person, and there are a lot of services that I would cut. And I think it's great. I honestly think it's great. I think the idea of, I guess two ways to approach this. I don't think it's great if they're the services I'm using. So I'm sure there are people out there who are using WorkDocs that are like, come on, what's happening? You know what I mean? Or using one of these other services.
Yeah, it's like every time Google kills something, there's a subset of people who really, love that thing, and they're very upset about it, of course.
Right. And it's going to happen anyways. But I do think that what I like is that they sort of, the communication was not good. We know this. Jeff Barr said, sorry, we made a mistake. We should have been a little bit clear about this. So the communication wasn't great. But I do think that before they cut any of those services, and maybe they did this. Maybe they did this and we won't see any more. But I really wish that they would have sort of just looked at all these, and again, like I said, maybe they did this, but look at all the services and say, this is not a good business unit. This is not a good business unit. This is just, doesn't have the adoption we need it to have, and so forth. So that if they were to kind of just do a huge cut really, really deep, and then move a lot of those people over to other services that, could use more attention and so forth.
Yeah, a coordinated effort on this would make a lot more sense. It's like, hey, we're cutting these 50 services, you got 18 months, some sort of longer deprecations. I've led a couple of deprecation cycles in my career, and they're always challenging, but the key is you got to give people enough time and a heads up about it, and then remind them constantly that the thing is coming.
And I think it would be interesting if there was a clear strategy around it too. Why those services particularly? If it is literally the business unit thing, if it's a business unit thing, then Lambda could be on the chopping block, right? Because Lambda is not a very good business. It's not a good business model, not for AWS, right? And so, and those are the things that make me a little bit nervous. But obviously, there's a fundamental thing that, to me, Lambda could be a loss leader service that drives revenue through the other services.
It's just so much glue for everything else that, yeah.
Right. It's the glue, right? So I'm not worried about Lambda, although, again, I'm not worried about Lambda. But I am worried about services like App Runner and some of these other ones because, like, again, App Runner does a lot of really great things, but it also, as a standalone service, it also potentially tries to do too much, right? So you can build from source with App Runner, which is kind of cool. You can just connect it to your GitHub repo, and it will literally do all the builds for you, containerize everything, and then go ahead and do the deployments. That's really great. I don't need that, right? I mean, maybe somebody else does. I mean, and maybe that makes sense. But I also think that you invest in those types of the bells and whistles on some of those things, and it almost breaks down the core of what it is. Like if you just said App Runner is, an auto scaling service that you can provision containers to that has, the load balancer built in, it's pretty much only for HTTP. I mean, you can connect to it and run other services, but through an HTTP interface, right? So I think that it's a great service, but trying to make it as like a standalone, like light sail or something like that, I don't think makes a lot of sense around that. And then there's the larger question, and this isn't really about deprecation, but this is more about consolidation, because there are 19 ways and maybe 20 ways or whatever it is now to run containers on AWS. I mean, you have Lambda and Fargate specifically moving very, very close to one another, right? And so it's like, other than the cold start on Fargate, versus the cold start on Lambda, they both run on the same. I guess I think they might run on different infrastructures now, because I know that App Runner runs on top of with Firecracker, right? So it's got a similar VM underneath or whatever, but I'm not sure about. I know Fargate can also run on top of EC2. I don't know. There's all kinds of weird stuff, but you're moving very closer together in terms of how you can trigger these things. And so if you have an asynchronous process that needs to kick off, you can start a Fargate task with EventBridge, right? So if I have to run a task in the background, why would I fire that off? So like, let's say it's some image processing that I have to do on an image that gets uploaded to S3. Well, use EventBridge to trigger that to a Fargate task, and then don't run it on Lambda. And maybe you can run a whole bunch of them at the same time or something like that. So the way that these get triggered, their use cases, the overlap between some of these things, the complexity that we've added with things like rolling time windows or rolling windows or whatever, like it just seems like there could be a overall strategy of sort of like, here's how you use compute on AWS, and here are the services that you can interact with compute. That, to me, I'd love to see a bigger strategy around that. And then the other thing with, stuff like, what's the call center app that they have, and then 475 different services under SageMaker. Like, it just seems like the two pizza team thing was great, but it may have run its course.
Yeah, I mean, I think like AWS is like the land of 1,000 CEOs, right? Like there's, each PM is basically like, spinning up these sort of separate projects. And I wonder at some point, without like particular controls in place, and you just have a lot of people, I think, that are maybe trying to make their mark or go for that promo cycle of like, we're going to spin up this service, even though it's pretty much the same as this other service, but it has this, take on it. And then you end up eventually with like 5 things that kind of do like similar stuff.
Or that do the exact same thing. I love the story about RDS proxy. If you've ever heard the RDS proxy, 2 teams were building RDS proxy without knowing that they were both building the exact same service. So there's more nuance to that story, but essentially one of them, they had to kill a project, so the other one took over. But I think you see that, and I do agree with the like, how do I make my mark type thing? And if you have individual business units who say like, oh, wouldn't it be cool if you didn't even have to build, you didn't have to compile your container locally and you could just build from source, like that's great. That's a really, really great feature. But the question is, who needs it, right? And then how does it fit into the larger strategy of what you're doing, with your cloud business? So I don't know.
I think one thing that I've been kind of frustrated with in AWS the last couple of years is 2 things. Number one, like when a service comes out, there's not clarity on like, is this actually ready for prime time, or are you like putting the feelers out and getting some things out there? Or just like, for an existing service, is this still getting worked on and looked at? Like it seemed like Cognito, nothing happened for 6 years. And there's some other services, I don't want to name, but like you just like talk to people and it's just like, yeah, that team is kind of a mess. Like I would not sort of bet on it. And it's like, you almost just have to go through the grapevine and hope you know somebody that knows somebody to understand like what's actually getting investment and what's not.
Yeah. I mean, there was also 27,000 layoffs or something like that last year from AWS. So who knows, like, how much of a crew for some of these things are still there. I mean, I'm sure a lot of that was not necessarily engineering resources, but like the, despite that, like you might not have people there that were like really focused on those things at this point.
I would say that the whole ready for prime time thing, I do think, or I kind of like how AWS will roll things out in preview as an experiment. But one thing that I have found is that if they roll something out in preview, it's almost certainly guaranteed to go GA, right? It may morph, it may change a little bit, but they definitely, they don't put things out there like, hey, we're thinking about doing this thing, here's a little demo of it, and then it just goes away when people start using it. And they're clear about like, don't use it in production because it might go away, or whatever. It's not ready for prime time. But I think once things go to GA, it's pretty solid, even if they don't do quite everything you need them to do. I do think there's a lot of tech debt at AWS, though. I mean, it's kind of interesting. We had a situation where I mentioned about throttling against the control planes. Some of the things that they built as convenience features just don't. There's just a lot that has to happen. So you make one API call and they make 6,000, right? And so that behind the scenes, right? And it takes a long time. And they literally, I forget what the number was, but we were doing something on their control plane for setting up I think it was just setting up certificates or something like that. And we started getting throttled. We had a conversation with the team. They're very great about the whole thing. But essentially their throughput, right? Like their quota was like 50 requests per second or something like that, or 50 requests per minute. It was very low. And we're like, oh, so we can do 50 requests per minute or whatever it was. And they're like, no. They're like, that's like for the entire region. Like, so anybody that's using this control plane has this limit. And look, I expect those sort of things. Like, I mean, the duct tape and popsicle stick that I've seen at companies is, it's real. And so yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of tech debt there. I think there's a lot of, things that they just have to figure out. But I do like that they release new stuff. Don't get me wrong. I do like that. But then I do agree with you that they should be spending more time on some of the products that that have been out there for a while also.
Yeah. I respect that they don't seem to do a lot of sort of vaporware that you might see at other companies. And that the fact that they had a limit of 50 requests per second for like everybody. I don't know how it works at AWS. You might have more internal information on this than me, but like I know at Google, like if you're building a new service, like of course Google has infrastructure to scale like I don't know, 1 million QPS or whatever, like, but it's not like anybody can just do that. You have to have essentially the demand to get there, and go through a certain process to spin up a service of that size. So generally, people are starting like really, really small, and then they're in order to build the demand. So I would assume like AWS is similar, where they're trying to control costs by limiting how much you can just like anybody can just like spin up a service that's like infinitely scalable.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the good thing about the tech debt is we have Amazon Q there to help us upgrade all this. I've seen a lot of Andy Jassy and Matt Garman talking about how it's upgrading and writing a lot of code. And Jeremy, I know you're sort of an AI skeptic, or I guess like where are you at in sort of like using AI in your development cycle?
Yeah, I use it all the time. I mean, I have ChatGPT open as well as Copilot enabled now. I disabled Copilot for a while because it was giving me a lot of junk, but I re-enabled it and use it quite a bit. I mean, I get very frustrated with some of the output because the things that are known, the known knowns, right, are very easy to find how to do those things, right? It's in the documentation. It's things that I have stored somewhere in my brain somewhere that I at least have the general idea how to do it. And then there are the things that I kind of know or I know about, or I guess the known unknowns. And when I ask those questions to ChatGPT or to Copilot, I am very frustrated honestly with the answers I get. Just as a quick example, I posted this, I think last night on Twitter, but I've been spending a lot of time with containers because we've been containerizing. We've been working on the container packaging format to deploy for the Lambda functions so that you can have bigger package size. And there's been some great work that AWS has done about caching layers and some things that make the cold starts. Actually, and AJ Struvenberg as well had posted about this, but it actually is pretty fast to run Lambda containers now. Of course, depending on the size of the package. But so anyways, I've been doing a lot of work on that, and so we were using Crane in order. If you're familiar with Crane, it's a Google Docker packaging format or packaging service that's like Docker Desktop or whatever. But it's more lightweight. It's very cool. So anyway, so we just appending layers and adding some images for the app layer and some of those other things. So very straightforward. Their documentation is terrible, right? And you're going through and you're trying to find what you're doing. So I'm asking the question in ChatGPT, and the thing spits back. And I said something like, "Is there a way?" How did I phrase this? Something like, "Is there a way for me to append a layer to an existing ECR or an existing image in an ECR repository?" Something, whatever I asked the question, and I thought I prompted pretty well. And it's like, no, unfortunately, there is no other way to do that. You have to rebuild the image and then, tag it or upload it to ECR, tag it, blah, 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 whatever. And I'm like,
I suppose you got to know and not just like a manufactured reason.
Right. So I'm like, but I said, what if I used Crane? And it's like, oh, you could use Crane to do exactly what you just asked me to do, even though I told you that you couldn't do it. And that's my biggest concern with. I guess that's my biggest concern with AI in general. And if we want to talk about AI as an assistive technology for helping us code, I use it quite a bit. Every once in a while, I'll just, I'll do a comment in my code and say, write me a loop that does, or, write me a reduce function that does X, Y, Z, blah, 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 whatever. And it usually spits out pretty good stuff that I can use. I am very, very much so, though. I love the term AI slop. If you've heard this term AI slop, and it's just basically all the junk that's produced. And I've posted about this a number of times. If I have to, I'm going to scratch my eyes out if I have to look at one more AI generated blog post image that is the title image. And I know that in the past, it's like, oh, well, Google loves when there's an image, or, social media loves when there's an image associated with your blog. And that's great that people can do that now, except that they're all the same and they all look terrible. And then the other thing is again, I curate a newsletter and I read, I probably review 300 to 400 articles per week. Most of them I dismiss because they're not quite on topic, or they don't look great. But I probably read, 70 to 80 articles per week and give them a quick overview. I know I could use, ChatGPT to summarize them if I wanted to, but I actually like to read them and see what they are. And I come across ones that are clearly generated by AI. And my problem is with that and that's the term that's been coined, AI slop. It's the stuff that just gets generated from AI. It's AI produced language or images and so forth. And this is something that I said a long time ago. I said sometimes I'm ahead of the curve here. So right after this started and we started seeing these Gen AI articles, I said, what's going to happen when AI trains itself on its own output? Like, I asked this question in January of 2023 or whenever, right after, people started using ChatGPT to do this. And then a few articles came out that kind of mentioned it. But then there was a pretty big study that Rice University did sometime last year, maybe August of 2023. And they coined this term called model autophagy disorder. And basically what it is that it's like incest, right? It's like what happens when you inbreed animals, right? That's why all Dalmatians are pretty dumb, right? Because they inbreed them in order to keep the line pure, right? So the problem is that if a model trains itself, on its own output, right? Because of the way that these models work, it basically every time it goes through, the quality degenerates, and it actually starts to form, it becomes less and less diverse. So
you're basically, because everyone says garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you're training on less quality information, because eventually the amount of data that's written stuff on the internet by humans is going to be eclipsed by the amount of written content by AI. And that becomes the dominant data input for essentially training the models. So you get like a Mobius strip effect essentially of
And the models have already stole all of the content on the internet. And I use the word stole because I do think that's another problem that I have with how some of this works, is that the AI couldn't be predictive, or Gen AI models couldn't be predicted if they didn't steal the work of other humans. And if they would have licensed it, something, it just would, they wouldn't have never been able to do that, right? So they had to steal that work, and they had to, and I think it's a copyright violation. I might be in the minority, but I think it is. But I think that information, they needed all that information. And the point I was going to say about this model, I want to say it's autography. I don't know. I can't pronounce the word. Anyways, but what they basically said was they took all of these faces, right? So they took a bunch of of people with different facial features, different skin tones, things like that, and they ran it through the model, and they said generate a new set of people based off of of this, and then it spit out a bunch of images of people. Then they trained it on those images and spit it out again. And by the time they got to like the fourth iteration, everybody looked the same, right? It was just like we were all blended into one big gene pool, and we all looked the same. And then they did the same thing with handwriting. So they took all these handwriting samples of like people writing A, B, C, whatever, and they took those letters and they ran them through, and they said, okay, spit these letters out, generate the letter A. And so they generated all those, they ran it through, and then 4 times through, or whatever that number was, it came back and all the letters looked exactly the same, right? Because it just degrades over time.
I think it's because you have a lot less sort of like it's less creative. Like if you ask, ChatGPT or something like that to create, a movie script or idea, it's going to be a lot of times like fairly general. Like it'll sound decent as like maybe a first cut, but like it you could tell, especially if you see a lot of these things. Like your story earlier of reading those, so many news articles a week, like. It reminds me, I was reviewing conference abstracts a little while ago, like hundreds of conference abstracts, and like probably half of them were clearly written by AI. And I don't mind people using AI as assistive technology to help but improve their writing. I do that all the time. But just like giving a prompt and then copying and pasting it and submitting it to a conference is the wrong way to go about it, and is very clear when you're doing that, because there's just signals, just like the images, there's certain like signals that make it clearly like stand out as something that was generated from an AI.
Yeah, and this is how I sum it up, and it's harsh maybe because I know you've got investors who have put billions and billions and billions of dollars into this, and I think AI is an amazing technology. I think there's so much that we can do with it, but Gen AI is a highly sophisticated parlor trick, and the output that you get from Gen AI, it is enough to fool you to think that it's good, right? And I agree, it's very, very cool what it can do, but the quality of that output is much lower and unoriginal, and that's my problem. And so if you want to take a CSV file and throw it into ChatGPT and say, hey, can you actually just break this down into categories for me or do some of that? Like, it is great for that. That's amazing. There's so many time-saving features. Let's use it for that stuff and focus on those technologies and those use cases. Let's stop generating content with it and stop generating images and stop generating videos with it. Oh God, the videos like give me nightmares when I watch these videos.
It's where there's like no expression or interaction between characters in the video. So I was just like staring off and like kind of moving, but that's that.
And then they just morph randomly. Like that's the weirdest. Oh, it's so weird.
Yeah. Those are the terrifying ones. Yep.
Yeah. When your elbow goes through your face, it's a little off-putting.
Do you ask people in your life, like outside of your programming circles, are you using ChatGPT AI? Like, do you see a lot of adoption from, I guess, like non-programmers generally?
I mean, my kids use all the AI features that are built into but they use all the AI features that are built into Snapchat and all the other things, all the filters and some of that stuff, whatever. But honestly, no. I mean, my wife's a teacher, for elementary school, and she doesn't. I mean, there's not like. She's like, oh, I know what it is, but I've never used it, right? And then most of the people that I know who are in the tech industry, but they'll use it as like a They'll use it for as like a novelty. You know what I mean? Like, so my wife's cousin, generated a poem with it that he used to put in my daughter's graduation book thing. I like just random stuff like that that they do. But I mean, I think people are using it. Certainly students, as you said. I mean, I think they're using it quite a bit. You've heard the mushroom book story, right? Did you hear the mushroom book story?
No, I don't know the mushroom book story.
No.
Somebody generated a book that they published on Amazon.com that was how to identify mushrooms. It was all AI generated, and a family followed it and got really, really sick from it.
Oh my goodness.
That feels like there's a real high, a really high chance of failure with that. Like that's like
right. With self-publishing books. I mean, the whole point is you used to have to go through quite a bit of work to get a book published. I think I know you self-published your book, Alex, but you didn't write it with ChatGPT and have the integrity to do it. Yeah, it wasn't there. I actually was sitting next to Alex in Seattle at a dev conference, and I'm like, what are you doing? You're like, I'm writing a book on DynamoDB. Anyways, but no, so I think there's obviously dangers to generating a lot of slop. And then the other thing is that, again, it's not accurate. Like the idea of it might hallucinate and it can be wrong. Like, no, it is almost certainly going to be wrong in some way, even if it's a subtle way, that in some cases could have disastrous consequences. And I'm not worried about Skynet. I used to joke about that. I'm not worried about, things becoming self-aware, because that's the other thing that I will say too. I think AI, where we are right now, we may have reached the peak. We've trained it on every bit of information, human-generated information we have. If we train it on information that it generates, we already know that that's going to just degrade the quality of it. I think what we've done, or what companies like OpenAI have done, is they've taken that. And again, I don't want to sound horrible about this, because I'm usually a pretty positive person, and I feel like I'm talking about a lot of negative things here. But this idea of taking that parlor trick, which is very, very good and does a lot of really interesting things, it's very fascinating, right? It's very easy to kind of distract people with it. They've taken that, and then they've built all these things around it, like RAG and all this other stuff that's like, well, how do we make it so that what it actually spits out is accurate and true, and what other cool features can we add and so forth, what other safeguards can we put in? I think that's going to be the majority of what these companies are going to need to spend their time on for the next few years. We were supposed to have self-driving cars 11 years ago. And they keep telling us next year, because the 90% is so easy. I have built so many things to 90%. It's that last 10% that's super hard. The last 10% is, hitting a kid, walking across a crosswalk. That 10%, like, that's important. You need to get that right. And I think that's where we are with the idea of Gen AI and so forth. And I know it's doing some cool stuff. Runway ML is doing some really cool stuff with video. Sora, again, is still nightmare inducing stuff. But like, there's a lot of really cool stuff that's happening out there. But how much better is it going to get? When it comes to the Gen AI stuff, like I think we've reached a point where I don't think it's going to get much better. It's going to be very, very incremental at this point. And AGI, the singularity, that is 100 years off, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree in terms of AGI. I think there needs to be a new innovation that, there needs to be additional step function. But I think what's going to end up happening, and I think we're already seeing this, is that really the investment over the next few years is going to be these like assistive technologies where, developers are already, have already jumped in on that with the co-pilots and stuff. And actually, I was reading Stack Overflow's annual developer survey recently, and they were saying, like, so basically 66.2% of the respondents, there's like over 30,000 respondents, said that the biggest challenge with these AI systems is trust, but everybody says that it increases their productivity. So even though they don't trust the output, they still see value in terms of it increases their productivity. So there is value, I think, from the assistive technologies. Just like when it comes to the self-driving car analogy, like we had forms of assisted driving for a very long time, and those are valuable too. Like if I have something that makes a sound or something that when I'm about to like back into somebody, or automatically brakes for me, like all these things are really, really helpful. But there's a big difference between that and I'm taking a nap in the back seat as my car like drives me to work. And I think that, like you said, that last 10% is we might not even have the technology essentially there today to solve that last 10, 20%. But there's tremendous value in these assistive technologies, whether it's being able to comb through massive amounts of information to get a summary, or take data that historically has been locked away because we don't have a way of like processing it, to be able to pull some insights out of it and put it into something that we can actually run queries and do analytics against. Like, there's a lot of value in those types of things.
I'm 100% there with you, 100%. And like that's where I use it the most, right? Like you take a article, you summarize the article, you generate maybe some key points of the article, like things like that, or taking large sets of data and running those through and doing things that it would take a human a long time to do, right? But the whole point here is that it's knowing that needs to be done. It's knowing that you need to analyze the data to look for something. It's like having that. And I don't know if you saw this, but there was maybe a couple weeks ago, somebody posted, I think it was their 8-year-old daughter or maybe 10, something like that. Anyways, that used I forget, maybe it was Cursor or something like that, to build a Harry Potter chatbot thing. And it was adorable, right? I mean, first of all, the girl was adorable, right? But she just, was typing in and it's making changes to the code, and she pushes up the Cloudflare. I made the joke. I said, AI is not going to take your job. An 8-year-old using AI is going to take your job. But it's sort of like even that. And I think you guys mentioned the Josh Pigford thing where he wrote a whole game, using Cursor or whatever. And that's very cool, and that's neat that you can do those sort of things, and that you can take somebody who maybe, and I think Josh Pickford's quite a pretty good developer, but like an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old or whatever, and be able to build something that is useful and whatever. Now the question is, was it good, right? Like, did it just work, or was it like a truly optimized something that would scale and do these other things? Like, I think that's a whole other question. I think Cursor has like a 2,000 line context window or something. I know there's limited context windows for some of these things. Even if they're massive context windows, can you actually make a lot of these changes? And then the other question is that how much does natural language translate into it, where you start thinking about APIs and posts and patch and puts and things like that, and like, what is it actually using behind the scenes? Is it doing the right thing? Is the security there? All these other things that I just don't think are shown in these really cool demos, right? Don't get me wrong, but for that type of stuff, like, I will use it as an assistive technology. I will not trust the output. I will use it and verify that it works. And then also, what's really great is sometimes it inspires me in the sense that it gives me something that I'm like, oh, I didn't even know that was a method that I could use there. And then I'll go and I'll look up that method and I'll learn more. So I do think it can make you a better programmer, but it doesn't make you a programmer, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do you think AI is affecting the job market for devs right now? Like, are we seeing a softer job market because of AI?
I think there are too many companies that are buying into the hype that AI is somehow going to replace developers, because I think without a developer steering it, or at least being have their hands on the wheel and one foot hovering on the brake, that these things can't do those, that they're not automated yet. So,
but even if you said, hey, I used to need 10 people and now I need 2 that have a Cursor subscription,
Yeah, so that worries me. That does worry me. And I think was it Charity Majors who wrote the article about basically getting rid of junior engineers or something like that? I don't remember if it was her. Somebody wrote an article about, and I apologize, Charity, if you're the one who wrote this article and I'm not giving you proper credit, or whoever did. But essentially, the article was about this notion that when you use junior engineers, sometimes as workhorses, right? Some, basically like, we need to, comb through this data, or we need to write a bunch of these functions, or we need to, build a whole bunch of tests around this, whatever. And yes, maybe some of that stuff is automatable now by, a senior or a upper level dev that can do some of those things. So I do think we probably see some of that right now. I think we're just going to shoot ourselves in the foot, though, because we're not, eventually some of these older devs are going to start aging out, and like myself, and they're not going to have all that context and experience because they never got into the business because there was no jobs for them. So I don't know. I do think it is having an effect. I do think there may be a correction. And I also think, like, again, I hope people wake up to the hype. Like, it is very good. And you can do a lot of things with it, right? But it is not the silver bullet that's going to solve everything for you and reduce your workforce. I mean, maybe in the helpline support side of things, because it's probably does a better job than some of the support people. But I think from a development standpoint,
SDRs as well.
Yeah, right.
I think I wouldn't be worried. Like, I think if you make let's say you make an engineer, suddenly one person's, can do the work of, 2 or 3 people. I don't think that means that suddenly there's 30%, less jobs. I think because even if you look at, like we were talking earlier about what you can do with things like AWS now, like 20 years ago, that took a lot more people to, build your own data center, run all this infrastructure. You had to staff, a whole bunch of people to be, going and swapping out hard drives in the middle of the night on a Saturday and stuff like that. But a lot of that stuff went away. But it's not like people's don't have jobs. What ended up happening?
We have way more programmer jobs.
Yeah,
now.
exactly. You end up it's now easier than ever to create a startup, build something, and deploy it and get up and running. So I think what ends up happening is, sure, maybe a company has net, they have less engineers or something like that, but you just end up with more companies doing more things, and it kind of ends up falling out the same.
And there's a law for that. I forget. I'm not as smart as Ben Kehoe, who can just keep all these things.
Jevons paradox.
Jevons paradox, maybe that's what it is, right? Yeah, like so.
I think that's one, like, where something gets cheaper, and you actually end up using so much more of it.
Yeah, right. You do more, right? So it's like, if you've got more time, you're not going to reduce. You're going to use that time to do more, right? Like, if you reduce your spend here, you're just going to spend more somewhere else, right? You're just going to do that. Yeah. So I think that's very true.
Even the companies that had a lot of the big companies that had major layoffs in the last couple of years, their actual number of employees ended up staying the same. They basically laid off and then rehired a lot of those people, but it was to redeploy resources into new projects that were more AI focused. So they're really just kind of reshuffling the deck in some sense. So it wasn't like they, really drastically reduced their headcount. And this article from Forbes came out actually today, which is the generative AI hype cycle is almost over. What's next? But in that article, it cites that 80% of...
Was that written by Jeremy Daly?
Yeah, it was written by Jeremy.
I may have ghost written that article. Yeah.
But according to this RAND Corporation report, 80% of AI projects fail. So there's basically 4 out of 5,
and the additional 19% people don't tell you about.
Yeah. So I think we're a long way before this is you're drastically seeing any kind of impact on, at least on engineering jobs.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, I asked you originally about just hey, are you seeing non-tech people? And Jeremy, you also talked about AI slop, and I'm finding it's surprising how often outside of programming I'm using Claude or ChatGPT on my phone to get around what I call SEO slop, which is just if I want a recipe or something like that, I Google a recipe and you get just garbage Google results where it's these giant things, the recipe's all hidden and all that stuff, where it's just man, screw it. I'm just going to go to ChatGPT or Claude to do that.
You don't want to read a 2,000 word essay about how they came to find this turkey recipe that they.
Yep. Or even just doing something simple. My wife the other day was how do I create a group of contacts in Gmail that I can send an email to? And I'm I don't know. Go ask ChatGPT. It's I could Google it and look through a bunch of crappy articles on that, but it's it's kind of cutting through the SEO slop, and now it's giving us AI slop, which but at least it's more concise.
Well, that's the problem with what happened. I think with Google is, if you want to rank well, even if the answer to a question is literally one sentence, you can't have a web page with a single sentence and rank well on Google. So now you need to write 2,000 words at least, where the one sentence is buried in there. It's kind of like a lot of these, I think, professional self-help books and stuff like that should be 1,000 word blog post. But in order to turn it into a book, they need to stretch it out with 150 pages of filler.
I will say this though about some of the, maybe not self-help books, but the books that they have like, I don't know, 5 principles, whatever the heck it is that they go through. Like I do find examples to be super helpful. So with it, and just like, so if it's like, do this, or this is like a strategy definition or whatever, like, and then give you like multiple examples of how that works. Like that to me is super helpful. And I think that's one of the places where AI filtering through that 2,000 word essay on why I discovered this turkey sandwich recipe or whatever it is, that part of it is you lose a lot of context, right? And so that is something where I like it if I need a quick answer, right? If I need a quick answer, great. But here's what my concern is. The more that we use ChatGPT and Google's new, what do they call it, Gemini or whatever, to answer that question and just give us that one line, give us, I hit the feeder bar, it gave me the treat, and I got the hit of dopamine because it answered my question, but I have no context around it, right? And so that makes me nervous, because if that's the thing that humans get used to doing, then what happens to people actually writing those examples and those lengthy, because I think there is value in some of those stories that some people want to see it, but I also think there's a bunch of people who just want to cut through it. But if we make it too easy to cut through some of that stuff to get the information that we need, then the question is what's the point of even writing that extra stuff if all you're looking for is just the answer?
Yeah. Yep. It's all going to collapse on itself again.
That's more of a humanity. That's humanity collapsing on itself more than an AI question. But
well, I mean, there's also the source attribution issue as well, where maybe I get the answer, but is it an answer that I can trust?
Right. Yes. Very much so.
Yeah. But I feel like I'm like one of the world's biggest like ChatGPT in your daily life advocates, at least in my circle of Omaha. I'm like trying to tell people, like they'll ask me a question, I'm like, I don't know, go ask ChatGPT, because they're like, you sort of have to use it for a while and get a feel for like where it's going to be good and where it's not going to be good. But there are just like so many times when people are like asking me how to do something, I'm like, I have no idea, but I know how you could get that answer. Like Excel formulas, like I don't know Excel formulas off the top of my head. Just go ask ChatGPT and all that sort of stuff.
But you also have you're all, if you ask it a question that you don't know anything about, right? Like if you just like are trying to research something, I worry about that. If it's something that you do know about, and this is actually the funny thing, and there are a few people who post on Twitter that they're what's the right word? They're prolific on Twitter. They post a lot of stuff, and when you post a lot of stuff, there's some stuff that's good, some stuff that's bad. And I read a lot of stuff, and I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that. And that's an interesting thing. Then they'll post something and I'll be like, I know that. And I know that what you're saying is to be incorrect. Or I've had a different life experience than what you're talking about there. And so that's why, again, influencers are a tough crowd, because it's tough to, and some of them are bought and paid for too. Others that promote certain PaaS platforms. Like, so you have to be careful about, where the information comes from. So even if it seems like it's a good source of information, like, I mean, I don't think AI changes, I don't think it changes that. I think you have to have context, and you can't trust everything you see, no matter who it comes from. And you've got to dive into that more. So yeah, I mean, I don't trust anything on the internet anymore. And the hardest problem is that you get something back on the internet, and then you search for it on the internet, and you just find a bunch of things that confirm either way, right? So it's really, really hard. And so I don't know, maybe we need to start going back to libraries and looking in books that weren't written by ChatGPT.
Just ban Google. Yeah, get rid of Google.
Well, they might be self-published books though, generated by.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Who knows how? I mean, it's the DynamoDB book co-authored by ChatGPT, right?
Yeah. We're gonna have like our own like Library of Alexandria or whatever it is that people find in 1,000 years, and it's just gonna be all these like crappy ChatGPT books that are like, how dumb are these
Idiocracy.
people?
Look, we are so close to Idiocracy. It's if you've seen that movie, but no, I mean, I think again, just quickly on the AI thing too. Like, I think if we can't figure out a way to filter out bad information, which that's Google's number one, like collecting information is easy. Filtering out bad information is really hard, right? I mean, all of the social media platforms have this problem too, right? So the issue is if we can't figure out a way to filter out what's good and what's bad, or to get the stuff that's good and filter out the stuff that's bad, then these models are going to be really, really hard to continue to train and learn anything new, right? And if everybody's inspired somehow by ChatGPT, even if you're just using it to, maybe you're writing a paper and you get one sentence from ChatGPT and that sends you down a whole path that probably sends the same people down. I mean, nobody's ideas are really unique anyways, but like you go down the wrong path and you just end up generating AI slop, even if you wrote it yourself, because it's based off of an idea that AI gave you. If we keep training and training and training and training on that, I mean, again, that to me is, we are polluting the information. We're polluting the world of information, and AI is just accelerating that. But again, I don't know. I'm just old, and I guess I don't know.
Get off my lawn.
Get off my lawn! Right? I yell at the old man yelling at clouds. That's kind of where I am now. But yes.
So we're running out on time, but there's one area I want to switch gears and talk about, because I've been asking a lot of people on it. Just front end development, right? I feel like there's like all sorts of noise, and it's hard to know like what's. I feel like that is like the topic du jour that I see on Twitter the most. And so many different opinions. So I want to get a sense of where you are. And number one, I saw in your newsletter yesterday, you were talking about how you like HTMX. Tell me the draw of HTMX, because like I am still confused on whether it's real or like whether it's a prank that people are playing on me. Like,
are they just trolling us? Like, seriously? Yes.
Yeah, I cannot tell. Okay, so tell me the draw of HTMX.
All right, so hypermedia, right? So nobody knows what this is anymore, except for maybe some of the older folks. But when the internet was designed, the idea behind it was essentially, when the World Wide Web was designed, was basically, the idea was it was documents, right? And so you had this document, and then you would go to this document, and you go to this document, and they would say, hey, what if you want to update a document? Okay, well, or create a new document on the web. How do you do that, right? And so that's where the whole idea of post came in, and then they're like, and then put was there, and then you're like, yeah, but what if we want to update a part of the document? Okay, now we have patch and like all these other things. So it was a very well thought out spec in terms of how these documents would work. And so at the end of the day, what you get from a web page, unless it's like a game or something like that, is essentially just a set of instructions that render a screen for you, right? So CSS and all that other stuff like that, that's all part of now, again, styling it and making it look good. But the big thing is, how do you get data back and forth from the server? And how do you mutate that screen? How do you change that screen that you're working on? And so way back in the day, when I was still probably writing Perl and CGI and got into, I don't know if anybody remembers SHTML, which was server-side includes, which was a pretty cool thing that you could do back then. But essentially is you could generate parts of an HTML document dynamically, right? By basically calling a script. So it was like a precursor to PHP or something like that. But we got to a point where we were able to generate dynamic documents, and that was pretty cool, right? So it kind of violated that first sort of step of just having like a document that was a thing and it was always the same. So we started generating dynamic documents, and that was pretty cool because we could do some really cool things around applications. And then we got to the point where we said, okay, we actually want to change information on this page without refreshing the whole page. We shouldn't have to fetch the whole document again. We want to change it, right? So if, the early days of AJAX, right, where we were able to just swap out something and then we write some code and make some changes. This all evolved. jQuery, Scriptaculous, Prototype.io, MooTools, like all these things gave us more and more capabilities to manipulate the DOM using JavaScript. And it worked fine. It just was a heavy lift. And, and I also question like whether or not browser speed and computer chip speed, we could still be doing it the old way and it probably wouldn't matter now. But somebody came up with this idea of, the virtual DOM where you could make all these changes in memory and then only apply the bits that you needed to do. And that's the basis of where we've moved to with front-end development. So you get things like React and Vue and a whole bunch of these other services that are doing something similar. But then I think we just pushed it way, way too far, right? Where it's like you now need so much tooling in order to generate all of these different packages and all these different I'm drawing a blank on what they're called, but all these different things that you need to deploy, all these different CSS packages and all these different, or bundles, right? Whatever, you're creating all these different things just in order to load a page and do something interactive on it. What I like about HTMX is it says, no, just write an HTML page and you can use your Tailwind and you can use, or CSS directly, do all that stuff. But then you're like, I want to do something when you click this button. I want to do something when when you scroll to a certain point. I want to do whatever I want to do. I want to manipulate this part of the page. So rather than you having to have this virtual DOM and all this other stuff that needs to maintain state and whatever, it basically just makes an HTTP call to the server, right? Using post, put, patch, update, delete, whatever it is, right? Or update's not one, but whatever it is, right? And then it just spits back a piece of that HTML that is going to replace where it is. And it works really, really well. Now, again, there are some things that I do like about, I love like the idea of Livewire, which is pretty cool because it does, I think, a better job of maintaining and manipulating the state on a page and re-rendering than some other services do. But the idea of like, if I needed to let's say there's stuff happening in the background and some table information updates, I want to update that on the page while I'm just sitting there. You can use WebSockets or long polling or some of these other things, server sent events, things like that, and you can manipulate that. It's not quite as easy to do that as just if you hit the API again, you get a new set of data, and then it calculates the DOM, it regenerates everything for you, and then spits it out. I just find, and I think that there are cases where you need to do that. I really like what Astro does with islands, where you can have a bit of that interactive code where you don't have to have the rest of the site be, completely powered by that. But I just think it's easier to grok if you think about, if you think about it more clearly. Like, I have an HTML page that has something on it, and I want to manipulate something on it based off of something that happens, how I interact with it, and then you just go to the server, you pull some information down. It is not it's backend agnostic, so you can generate HTML with Python or with Flask or with Node or Java, whatever your backend is built in. So you have to think about it how we used to think about it when we were building Ajax apps way back in probably 2003.
Yeah, it's basically what's old is new again. Like we were original like dynamic web servers were super server heavy, where essentially everything was a re-render of the entire page, and
you were generating the whole page every time, right?
Yeah, and then we tried to fix that with Ajax, but those became a little bit like overly complicated and hard to maintain as well. And then we went like extreme to the essentially the single page, everything's happening in the front end, and your server becomes just kind of like a dummy proxy to your database to pull data. And then those perform terrible on phones, and they also become like completely unmaintainable. And now it's like everybody's like, oh hey, we have these like beefy servers, we can actually do stuff on those. Like let's serve HTML from there, and then we're like rediscovering this. And I think that is the pattern. Like we had Kent C. Dodds on the show, and he talked about that and sort of the evolution of these different paradigms. But I think we went one extreme, and then we swung the other extreme, and then now we're kind of back to the middle again.
Yeah, and I like this. I like the simplicity of it. I think it's super easy to do. The other thing that's great about HTMX is you can basically use like a static site generator to generate a whole bunch of stuff to start with. I did a couple of live streams on like progressively enhancing it by just making a call at so you just load a static page, and then once the page is loaded, it can actually just kick off some onload things, and it will fill in some data for you, and it's pretty cool. I mean, the whole React server component debate that's happening now, like, I don't know if it's a debate or just to me, it's just, again, it's like, so what you did is you shifted everything this way, like you just said, but you're like, well, that probably isn't as efficient when we can generate a bunch of this stuff, ahead of time and spit that down. I haven't played around with it much since it first kind of they started hyping it up, but I think it pretty much what I've seen is it renders the code on the server, sends that down to the browser, then has to like make another call to make it interactive or reactive, and then it refreshes all of it. So you got to make a whole bunch of calls to the server just to load a page, and it's like, if I know what this page is going to look like and I want to fill in some information, like it, why is this so hard? So I don't know. I think HTMX, it very well could be just people trolling us, but it is, I think it's genius in its simplicity. And I mean, the other thing is like SvelteKit also feels kind of like HTMX in some way, in how some of that stuff works. I do like Astro. I think Astro is really, really cool. I like that you can generate stuff statically. I like that they have the whole fragment capability. It's not as organized as I would like it to be. I don't like that Astro just like officially said, hey, Netlify is our provider. Like that to me is, I mean, I guess there's some value in it for Netlify and maybe for Astro, but like I like the idea of
there's some weird games in the front end market, and I guess like we're not breaking any news here that like the front end market is still jumbled. It's been a mess for like 35 years or 25 years or
we've been doing this stuff for a while.
But I think the big takeaway is for me on HTMX, I'm one of those like when I do front end, I'm like one of those developers that knows React and doesn't know HTML, and I'm like, I have to use like component libraries and all that stuff to make it work. So then it's like, when I look at HTMX, I'm like, what are these real tags going around and things like that? So that's
well, component. I mean, that's the other thing too, is like the component libraries. I mean, that is one thing that I will say that I do really like about how some of these other things work, or like how React works, for example. Like you just drop in a component library and a whole bunch of this stuff is built for you. All of that interactivity, like it's all there. And I like how you can package that stuff. And that is a huge advantage to using something like React. The question is did you need all that in the first place, in order to make it work? So it depends on what you're building, but like I use HTMX to build a whole bunch of internal dashboard like stuff and interactive dashboards, or admin type utilities, things like that. I built the news quiz runs on HTMX actually. So if you go to the quiz.offbynone.io, that's all built on HTMX and Hono on the back end running on Ampt. So yeah, I mean, I think it's got legs, but I do worry about people like you, Alex, who only know how to use React.
It really is true, but at least the good news is ChatGPT and Cursor will save me. I don't need to learn these dang tags anyway. So,
well, I think also one of the things that you see, like sometimes there can be something that comes along that's like a better idea, but it doesn't necessarily end up creating traction because there's already essentially like a groundswell of network effects behind something that's already like the incumbent technology. Is really hard to get that, because like the switching cost is so high for a company to be like, oh, okay, we're gonna rip and replace our React front end to this new technology, right? So it's just like like Craigslist has looked the same for 35 years, and there's really no sort of like, people have broken off pieces of it, but for like low end jobs and I don't know, meeting strangers online, like there's like nothing that really competes with it, and it's because they have that network effects essentially.
Well, I also think that there are principles like, so the principle that I really like about HTMX, which is I also like about Tailwind, and again, I know some people hate Tailwind. I used to write CSS by hand back in the day. I hate writing CSS, but it's too many different things to do it. So I think a principle that runs through those is the idea of locality of behavior, right? And it's basically saying like, if I'm looking at a piece of code or something, how much of that is buried in an abstraction that I don't actually know what it's doing, right? And so that's one of the things with like sometimes with React components and some of these other things where like a lot of that styling is buried in layers and layers and layers of abstractions that I have control over probably, but like it's sort of hard to see. So the idea of saying like, writing inline CSS where you just say, okay, BG-red 500, like I know looking at this piece of HTML code that this is going to have a background color of red, right? Like I just know that's going to happen. And maybe it's writing a lot of code, but again, Tailwind is very much so on the idea of componentizing the way that it works. So you have the locality there, but you componentize it so you don't have to write the same thing over and over again. But I also like that about HTMX in the sense that he's very big, Carson Gross is very big on this idea of fragments, right? Which is to say, you want to take an entire HTML document or a section of an HTML document that's big enough for you to kind of grok and understand what's happening there. And maybe you have like an edit screen, maybe you have like just a display screen, maybe there's a different way that something's formatted. So the idea is rather than breaking that up into hundreds of component files, right? Separate files and separate API routes and all the stuff that you have to manage, that if you can use a system that allows you to fragment those, to say, I need this from this template. I just need this fragment from this template, and I can go ahead and use that, and then I can re-render that and update a part of the screen using HTMX interactive interface. Then that's a much easier way to grok things, because you're not saying like, oh, I need to get the edit screen, so I need to go do this, and then I got to go look in this file and do that. And I actually built an open source package called Fraglets, which is about fragments on top of templates, which just uses nunjucks under the hood. But I just built in a couple of extra features. So you can basically grab a nunjucks template, and then just using the block syntax, you can just grab a fragment from it and render it as if it's a template, and it compiles down into JavaScript so that you can import it dynamically into your file. So it's great for things like Lambda and some of these other things. So I built that because I was like, I need a better way to do fragments using Node. But anyway, so I think that's interesting. And I do think that if the locality of behavior is a really good thread that is worth pulling, and the benefits, the DX improvement on that, right? The developer experience versus trying to grok this really complex, dependency tree, I think is really helpful.
Yep. Well, I think we need to wrap this up, but I do appreciate your commitment to the bit and keeping the HTMX troll alive and explain. No, it's a good stuff. And Jeremy, thanks for coming on. It's been fun to chat with you. If people want to find you, find out more about you, find out more about Ampt, where should they go?
Yeah. So you can my blog / website / whatever, jeremydaly.com, DALY.com. I'm on X and all of the X is Jeremy _Daly, and then I'm on LinkedIn as well. That you can do that. And if you want to check out Ampt, getampt.com. It's AMPT.com. Sign up. It's free. Play around with it. Tell us what you think. If you can explain it to me, that'd be great, because then maybe I can explain it to more people. But I don't know, it's new, it's fun. It's it may be a little early, but we'll see what happens.
Jeremy, thanks for coming on. Sean, enjoy your international travels that you have coming up. And we'll see you around next time.
Awesome.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Jeremy.